29 texts from the wife of Supreme Court Justice to then President Donald Trump's chief of staff in the days after the 2020 election. Ginny Thomas wrote on November 6th, "Do not concede. It takes time for the army who is gathered for his back." And then another text on November 19th, "Make a plan, release the Kraken, and save us from the left taking America down." Democrats are, of course, outraged and are pushing for Justice Clarence Thomas to recuse himself from Trump January 6 cases, with Senator Ron Wyden saying his conduct looks, quote, increasingly corrupt. Minority Leader Mitch McConnell released a statement on Friday, though, saying that he has total confidence in Justice Thomas and his brilliance and impartiality. So we are here now with Ginny Thomas, kind of repeating these really extraordinarily outlandish claims. I think for a lot of people, just on that front, it's shocking that some of these conspiracy theories have gotten this far.
Exactly. But I would say, I was struck by what you pointed to, which is that there has been concern amongst Democrats in Congress, but you thus far have seen the top two leaders, Republican leaders in Congress, really not suggest that that Clarence Thomas should recuse himself from these cases because of the text that his wife made.
Yeah, I mean, they think it's no problem. And the January 6th committee, though, is looking at some of this, but it seems somewhat unlikely that they will pursue this any further. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's an open question. There's a big debate, and remember, one person in this committee is Liz Cheney. She is someone who is very close, and despite her being in the outs right now for pursuing this investigation, the Thomases are held up in high esteem in conservative circles. Going after Clarence Thomas's wife could potentially be problematic for someone who's still looking to keep her seat come the primaries that she's facing, of course, a Trump-backed challenger. Now, it still remains to be seen exactly how they managed to move forward here, but it is just remarkable to see the wife of a Supreme Court justice advance really outlandish conspiracy theories, and even after January 6th, suggest that the vice president of the United States could have overturned the election, which has no basis in legal rationality. And here we have the justice that who's decided not to recuse himself in dealing with the January 6th case, raises a lot of questions, but the decision to recuse is up to Thomas himself, and he doesn't look like he's going to do it.
It reads like the Facebook comment section of some relative that maybe someone's have.
There's some darker places on the internet than even that.
And yeah, look, it is an illustration that Ginny Thomas was a conservative before Donald Trump came along. Donald Trump was still giving money to Nancy Pelosi. She was a conservative. What it does show, I think, is just how much the Trump effect has reshaped conservatism, right? The language that she's using, the references are so deep down these rabbit holes of sort of online far-right conspiracy theories. This is not like low taxes, less regulation of yesteryear. This is like, you're spending a lot of time on the internet, and these references are so arcane. Again, this is the kind of stuff that you'll see on a Facebook comment section. And like, what the heck is
But
this?
it is now the litmus test for the Republican Party. Donald Trump rescinded an endorsement of Mo Brooks over this very issue. And take a listen to what Brooks said about that.
The president has asked me to rescind the election of 2020.
You said that's illegal. You can't do that. What did he ask you, and what did you tell him?
He always brings up, we've got to rescind the election. We got to take Joe Biden out and put me in now.
He still says that.
Yes.
Hell hath no fury like a man with his endorsement rescinded. I'll tell you what. He has seen the light.
When you're more
He is speaking
outlandish
truth
than Mo
now.
Brooks, I think you're kind of in some really dicey
Mo Brooks is
territory
now
there.
going public. He's like, all of a sudden, Mo Brooks has discovered his conscience about President Trump's very troubling demands. I don't know. The timing is very special. What do you
On the
think?
other side of that, though, in Georgia, where former President Trump was last night, David Perdue is going all in on the conspiracy theories.
Because, look, they realize that this is the only thing that Donald Trump cares about. You have to repeat what he has been lying about since right after the election that he lost. Otherwise, what happens? He rescinds the endorsement. But look, the reason why Mo Brooks lost the endorsement is not because Trump says he's anti-woke. The reason why is because Brooks is tanking. He may lose in this primary, and then Donald Trump will be a huge embarrassment for Trump.
Raises the question about his juice. I mean, is he picking the right horses in these races?
I mean, I think there were questions about was he ever picking the right candidates from the get-go. But I mean, in Georgia, if you look at things, I mean, it's a challenge to go against any incumbent when, by most accounts, Brian Kemp, the governor there in Georgia, has done things that Republicans and conservatives are happy with. They are pleased with how he has governed. And so the issue there in Georgia is that David Perdue was always, facing an uphill challenge against an incumbent governor.
Right.
I think the bigger question to me, though, is that who former President Donald Trump endorses is very different than if Trump himself chooses to run again, because he has always been the person that rallies parts of the Republican base, not the people he endorses.
I mean, is there any concern that, Trump is really jeopardizing Republicans' chances?
Look, I think in some of these campaigns, if he pushes forward a candidate who would have a hard time winning the general, it could cause problems. I think that the view generally, Abby, on the right is the wind's at their back. There's going to be a backlash to President Biden, and that this is going to be a good year to be a Republican. But look, we all covered 2010, and we recall that candidates do matter. And if you get behind a candidate, even in a good year for your party, who is, not acceptable in the general election, that candidate could still lose.
Well, we'll leave it there. Thank you all for being here this Sunday morning, and thank you, Wilson Center, and also CNN contributor and former Moscow bureau chief Jill Doherty. Great to have both of you here. Look, there's a lot happening this week when it comes to Europe, but the capstone of it was this Biden, you could call it a gaffe. He had already called Putin a war criminal, a butcher, but now this. What's the significance, you think?
Well, this was, I think, one of the three most important speeches given by an American president in the last 60 years. You have Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Reagan in Berlin, and now Biden, talking not just about this moment in history, but about this juncture in history. The gaffe is certainly kind of absorbing all of our attention, but I think history will look back on this speech as one in which he is trying to pull the West back together again after years of a fraying alliance. And he's trying to say, we have to stay the course. We can't let the kind of fatigue that often sets in divert us from what is a challenge, not just in Ukraine, but ultimately between Russia and the West, defining, what the 21st century looked like. Biden had so hoped to move this pivot to Asia, not be dragged into European wars, and he's back where he was. This is a moment to try to move on, to say, let's deal with this and get back to business.
Much ado about nothing?
Unfortunately, I think those, the last 9 words are the thing that people are focusing on. Obviously, you're focusing on history, which is important, but I think, I understand the emotion, and I'm sure President Biden is seeing much more than we are seeing about the horrible.
I mean, he had just visited these refugees. I mean, he had really been up close and personal with them.
And we know that he's a personal person.
Right.
So I'm not surprised that he feels that way. But right now, in terms of what's happening on the ground, it's not only history, but it's the actual war. And so there could be other ways of saying what he wanted to say. Now, I watched how, Russia is reacting to this. Putin has been thinking about this for years. Right. This is no surprise that the Russians know that he wants to, that the United States would love to do regime change, at least in their eyes. But I think their reaction has been interesting because they're concentrating more on the comments by Biden that this is going to be a long war and we have to stay in there. They are not talking so much specifically about regime change, because I think that is uncomfortable for the Russians to bring up. By the way.
Yeah, and Peskov kind of shrugged it off and was like, well, it's not, not for Biden to decide. And some people read that as just them sort of, it's baked into the cake. And I think there is an argument to be made, perhaps, that Putin is not going to spare the Ukrainians, whether Biden calls him a war criminal or not, whether Biden says he should go or not. Is there any validity to that?
I think one of the big questions is, what is Putin going to do in response? They may not want to bring this up in public because this is embarrassing. It's humiliating. Yeah. And Putin is very thin-skinned. We know that. This is a campaign that's important. But Biden has also made this comment at a time that the Russian military is not doing very well. And so do you have that intersection where they try to say, well, we're just looking for Donbass. We're really not looking for all of Ukraine. Nobody's going to believe that.
Well, what does the climb down look like? What can a structure of a ceasefire or peace deal look like? Would the Ukrainians have to give up the Donbass, have to cede some territory? Would Russia agree to what some people have described as a kind of, neutrality for Ukraine, meaning that, the United States agrees to protect Ukraine and so does Russia. What does that look like?
Neutrality already is out there.
Yeah.
I think that they can do with neutrality.
Yeah.
In terms of recognizing Donbass, those two people's republics, I think you might be able to fudge that in some way that you could not recognize, because after all, they're saying they're independent countries, and Russia is too. Crimea, you might be able to do that too in some fashion by saying, de facto it's in control, but not forever. But I think these are very difficult political decisions for President Zelensky, because there are many people in Ukraine who simply won't go with that. And it could challenge his presidency to do that.
Yeah, I just don't think that Zelensky, having fought, and the Ukrainian people feeling very deeply. Remember, this war didn't start for them on February 24th. This war started 8 years ago. Yeah. And the danger is that even if there is some kind of limitation on Russia's offensive now, that doesn't mean that this is over. I mean, Putin has made clear for 15 years now that he sees Ukraine as part of Russia. That's what he genuinely believes. And so whether there's some kind of limit right now, this war is not going to end. And that's the problem. And I don't think Zelensky is in a position that even if he wanted to, he could compromise very much.
Just take a quick listen to President Biden this week talking about what the future holds for Europe and the United States.
America's ability to meet its role in other parts of the world rests upon a united Europe and a secure Europe. We have learned from sad experience in 2 world wars when we've stayed out of and not been involved with stability in Europe. It always comes back to haunt us, the United States.
Is this a pivot point for the world, for global security going forward?
Absolutely. There's no question. I think, when you look at events, the end of the Cold War, the end of, let's say Putin's presidency, all of this to me is the biggest event, because Putin is taking it to the end here. He is risking his entire country. His economy is really cratering. Domestically, he has problems. Militarily, he's stuck in a war, whether he wants to end it or not, how he ends it. I think it's very, very, it's really a turning point.
Yeah, it certainly feels that way. A great conversation with both of you. Thanks for being here.
It will not be easy. There will be cost, but it's a price we have to pay, because the darkness that drives autocracy is ultimately no match for the flame of liberty that lights the souls of free people everywhere.
But this morning, Biden is back in Washington, where polls do show that Americans are skeptical of his Ukraine response so far. Joining me now with their reporting and their insights, Jonathan Martin of the New York Times, Asma Khalid of NPR, and CNN's Manu Raju. So, guys, President Biden had this big moment on the world stage and delivered an incredibly forceful speech, derailed by a few words at the end. But also, I was struck by the White House moving so quickly to publicly walk it back.
It was so striking that walk back, Abby, came literally before the motorcade even got to the airport. Amazing. After the speech. And the reason it came so fast, I was talking yesterday to some folks in the White House, and I was so struck by the speed of that walk back. And I said, there was no way that you guys could try to embrace that statement. Yeah. And what they said was basically his dedication to keeping the coalition in NATO together is such that there is no way that they could try to sort of own the gaffe, if you will, because it would have roiled every other European capital that so far has been in sync with the U.S. In confronting Vladimir Putin. And the idea that Biden could simply call for regime change and not consult Paris, London, and Berlin was just not acceptable. So they had no choice but to walk back Biden's comment.
But I mean, the irony of this all is that the American people seem to want him to be tougher. The polls show that 52% oppose his handling of Ukraine. They want him to be tougher. That statement was, to some people's ears, tougher.
It was, but it was also, I would say, to many people's ears, a suggestion of regime change, which is just something that by most foreign policy experts' accounts would essentially escalate the conflict. And at this point in time, I mean, it also suggests that there's not really a whole lot of room of negotiation with Putin. And if you want a ceasefire, you need to be able to negotiate with Putin. I will say, I think that the trouble that President Biden has is that because he has wanted so much to have a united response with allies, you have to move at the pace that many of your European allies and the rest of the world wants to move at.
Yeah,
and that means sanctions, largely. But
And look, that's been the real challenge for Biden so far, because he wants to maintain unity, but he also wants to talk tough and deal with Putin as tough as he can. But oftentimes it's at a much slower pace than what the American public wants, but it's the pace that his allies wants, whether it's revoking Russia's trade status. That's something that he was pushed by Congress to do. Ultimately, he said yes, but he hit the brakes on that initially because he was trying to get the allies on board. And this has been the challenge for him all along, where it's an off-the-cuff comment saying that he's a war criminal, or off-the-cuff comment calling for regime change. The challenge is maintaining unity, but also maintaining diplomacy.
This is the classic Biden, though, right? Yeah. He is what he is. And part of his appeal is that he's the unvarnished product, and that has helped him politically over the years. Yeah. It's also dogged him politically over the years. I have a book coming out May 3rd. You can buy it now. This Will Not Pass. You can pre-order it today. Me and Alex Burns, that talks more about this, that there is this debate inside the White House about, do we let Biden be Biden, or do we try to restrain him, limit his access to the microphone, because he can sometimes step on the best crafted remarks, even speaking to the world in Poland.
Yeah. He was faced this week with the question of how this would affect his electoral prospects, Democrats' electoral process. Here's what he said.
No election is worth my not doing exactly what I think is the right thing. Not a joke. I'm too long in the tooth to fool with this any longer. My focus, if any election, is on making sure that we retain the House and the United States Senate, so that I have the room to continue to do the things that I've been able to do in terms of grow the economy and deal in a rational way with American foreign policy and lead the world.
I mean, when I talk to Democratic analysts, though, about the midterms, I will say that Ukraine is not, at this moment in time, really at the top of the list for what domestic concerns are amongst voters. And I know that's a sort of harsh reality. I think if things were to drag on for an extended time, that may change, but it's largely broader frustrations that people have, and that's tied to COVID and the economy, right?
Yeah, and yet, I just want to show this to the audience. This is an ad from American Bridge, Democratic Super PAC, trying to tie Republicans to a sort of pro-Putin message. This is in Ukrainian, by the way, and it's, I forget what it says here, but it's in Ukrainian. I don't speak Ukrainian, but it's tying Republicans to this issue.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see if it's effective, but you're absolutely right. I mean, this is an issue about how Americans feel. And if this war drags on and prices continue to drive up at the pump, that's what will drive voter frustration at the end of the day. But the question is that if the American public does believe that Biden is handling this well, that improves his approval ratings overall, which we have not seen much example of yet, but this is still early in this crisis. Perhaps that could also lift Democrats down ticket. That is how this could eventually impact the midterms, because in House races in particular, oftentimes it depends on how the president power is doing. The party down ticket could suffer if he's struggling, and right now Biden
If Biden's at 41, 42% approval on election day, that's going to doom Democrats up and down the ballot. And the truth is, as long as gas prices are where they are or worse, it's going to be very difficult. Right. I had one senior White House person tell me a couple of weeks ago, he said, look, it's going to be tough for us to message domestically out of this crisis as long as gas is where it is. And I think unless that changes sometime soon, they're going to have real issues in the White House.
All right, we'll have to leave it there on this issue. But coming up next for us, history of this country, there have been 115 Supreme Court justices. All but 7 of them have been white men. And soon, that number may be 8.
I am here standing on the shoulders of generations of Americans who never had anything close to this kind of opportunity. I hope that it will bring confidence. It will help inspire people to understand that our courts are like them.
Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson will almost certainly be confirmed, but that didn't stop some Republicans on the Judiciary Committee from aggressively interrogating her last week.
Can you provide a definition for the word woman?
Do you agree with this book that is being taught with kids that babies are racist?
I want to try to understand here. Is it your view that society is too hard on sex offenders?
You know, kind of playing for a different audience here in that room. What do you think is going to be the impact of that kind of questioning on this particular nominee?
Well, look, it's not going to prevent her from being confirmed. She has the votes to get confirmed. Joe Manchin of West Virginia said on Friday that he is going to be a yes vote. The Democrats will keep their party united, but this will be one of the closest confirmation votes in history, given the nature of the 50-50 Senate and given the nature of how polarized the confirmation process is. I mean, there's no doubt that both sides will agree, that she's a well-qualified jurist, someone you cannot dispute any of that. But the way that the confirmation process has completely devolved and broken down over the years, both sides clearly, of course, blaming each other for it, it just shows that no matter how qualified you are, to get more than a couple of votes from the other side is incredibly difficult these days, maybe even impossible these days. In the confirmation hearings show just why that's the case.
And on the Democratic side, there's no question her treatment was sort of almost a galvanizing moment for progressives.
It was. And I do think, though, this point of the process is really important to bring up, right? Republicans clearly saw this as, I think, a pre-midterm campaign strategy to test out some of their messages. But I was struck, I was looking at polling from Gallup, and they look at all this stuff from how popular various nominees in recent history have been. She's up there with, now Supreme Court Justice John Roberts as one of the most popular, in terms of public opinion, of the American public approval rating. And so you look at Congress and where she's going to get confirmed. I think John Roberts got confirmed like 78-22. It was an overwhelming approval in Congress. She's not going to get anywhere near numbers like that in Congress. It feels like the public and Congress is just totally out of sync.
And you can see, over the years, it's almost impossible. Now, it used to be almost unanimous Supreme Court nominees,
look
and now
Breyer,
it is not.
90-9 on the screen, who she is replacing.
Yeah.
And by the way, you know who voted to confirm Stephen Breyer? A fellow named Mitch McConnell from Kentucky. Because back in that period, early 90s, certainly in the 80s as well, this was a vote that, unless the pick was controversial at some level, typically sailed through. It's now become one more red versus blue, tribal up and down vote. And I think that's why we are where we are. You mentioned Democrats being galvanized by this. All of us get these emails, press releases, and pitches for money in our inboxes. I couldn't help but notice this week that Cory Booker sent out an email to his list talking about his comments, which of course got picked up widely on the left and were seen as very inspiring to a lot of folks in the party. That was fascinating to me. I think Booker knows he had a good moment there, and he said he was.
Let's go ahead and just play that.
There you go.
For me, I'm sorry. It's hard for me not to look at you and not see my mom, not to see my cousins. One of them who had to come here and sit behind you. She had to have your back. I see my ancestors and yours. Nobody's going to steal the joy of that woman in the street, or the calls that I'm getting, or the texts. Nobody's going to steal that joy. You have earned this spot. You are worthy. You are a great American.
So Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz wanted some viral moments, but that was the viral moment of this week.
Yeah, it was one of them for certain. I was in the room at the time, and I was watching the audience. I was watching her family right behind her. There were people, all of them in the front row were wiping tears out of their eyes. Several of them were. She was too. So it was a very emotional moment. Which was also striking too is that there were very few Democrats on that committee who did just that, defend her in such vigorous terms. Now, Booker is different. Of course, he's the one black member on that committee. And of course, he spoke to, how the impact on his family and the like, and growing up as a minority. But still, you didn't really see as much from Democrats. And that was one of the criticisms that I heard, because they tried to avoid kind of the back and forth mudslinging that we have seen in confirmations past. And Dick Durbin, he did push back from time to time against Ted Cruz, against Josh Hawley, but they wanted to keep the process moving. They didn't want to see what happened in the Kavanaugh proceedings. And as a result, you didn't see very many moments from Democrats really aggressively defending
Could that have been a mistake?
I mean, I think for Booker it was an opportunity. I mean, probably the best moment Cory Booker has had since he came to the U.S. Senate. And I can hear the voices of his campaign staff saying, if only we had that moment during his campaign, because obviously his campaign for president flamed out a couple of years ago.
For the future of Supreme Court, confirmation processes. Lindsey Graham giving us a little bit of a hint this week that we could be in this broken place for a while. The Republican dogma on this seems to be we will confirm Supreme Court justices of a president of the opposite party whenever we feel like it, and not a second before then. He says to the Washington Post, it's a tricky situation, Graham said, is if Thomas or another justice were to die in 2023 before the actual primaries and caucuses start in the presidential campaign. He says this is sort of uncharted territory, which of course it is actually not. Twice before has the Senate confirmed a Supreme Court nominee in a situation like that. We're just in kind of no man's land when it comes to this, I think.
I do think the process being broken is really a valid point to bring up. I'm not entirely convinced that this will not electorally backfire on Republicans to some degree. I think the assumption that you can be, Democratic organizers were telling me that they thought, particularly women of color, that they thought some of the questioning was disrespectful and rude. That all being said, the midterms are a long time away, and I'm not sure this will be top of mind.
Mitch McConnell is not committed to, if he's majority leader at next Congress, to confirming a Supreme Court nominee if there is a vacancy. And if there is a vacancy, they could potentially keep it open through 2023, 2024, and it just shows you how this has just completely devolved. Even Democrats, when they were in power, they let Clarence Thomas go through despite the fight in that confirmation proceeding. And who was the chairman of that committee? Joe Biden. They still had hearings.
It's just incredible. Thank you all.